Tony, can you unmute?
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tony Oro, I'm the co-director of the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute here at Stanford. And we have a really great seminar today with Karl Sylvester and Alyson Falwell, looking at the Clinical Research Support Office's role. This seminar series is really designed from Stanford. It's designed to the maternal and child health mission, how to accelerate translational research, taking basic science discoveries and trying to make them, accelerate them into a clinic for our patients. And so the seminar series really is continuing this summer. Next slide. So I wanted to make sure after today's seminar that we want you to join us for in 2 weeks on Monday, July 27th, where we'll see Joe Thomas. We'll talk about clinical informatics and research informatics at Stanford, understanding how to take sort of a big data approach for understanding and accelerating child health. Next slide. As well, on our website, you'll see all of the seminar series we have this summer, which includes August 17th, where we'll have the Biodesign Fellows talking about designing improvements for health and healthcare. September 14th, we'll have an amazing seminar on preventing gender-based violence among adolescents. In October, talking about vector-borne diseases and how to prevent them. We'll have our seminar series, our annual seminar symposium in November, and then in December, the new head of the population health program at Stanford, Melissa Bondi, will talk about pediatric and adolescent brain cancers. Next slide. I wanted to announce the 2020 virtual symposium research seminar that's in November, on November 6th. It's going to be an amazing interactive symposium featuring David Williams from Boston Children's as our keynote speaker, and as well, Bonnie Maldonado, one of the local experts on COVID biology and health, will talk about and head looking at COVID research and the impact on maternal and child health. So please look for the announcement for abstracts for this symposium on November 6th, and please submit your abstracts as an announcement will come out in about 2 weeks. All right, next slide. This is the group of folks on our education committee. You're welcome to join. If you have any suggestions, please contact one of us. Next slide. And please, we're going to send you a survey. Please give us feedback of things you want to see, how to make this seminar series more important or more helpful to you. So please fill out the survey. Next slide. And so today, I want to introduce Karl Sylvester and Alyson Falwell. Karl is really the pioneer and the driver of this clinical research support office role as the Associate Dean for Maternal and Child Health Research and Director of the Clinical Research Support Office at Stanford Children's Hospital. He's a professor, a co-investigator at the NCAT-sponsored CTSA at Stanford. And his research really is now as co-director of the recently launched Stanford Center for Metabolic Health, where he directs the maternal and newborn metabolic phenotyping for disease risks. Really an incredibly important new offering for clinical and translational data. Alyson works with him and is really the clinical research operations manager of the CRSO. She's worked for the last 20 years in clinical research operations, management, and quality. So she's really uniquely qualified to talk about how this translational research support office can accelerate research in maternal and child health. And so I'll stop there and hand it over to Karl. What I want to say is, please, we'll have a series of questions and answers at the end. So use the chat function of the Zoom to basically provide questions, and I'll actually ask those questions at the end. So Karl, thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Oro, and good afternoon, everyone. Great pleasure to be here to present to you. Just briefly, Alyson and I are going to present to you a little bit of the journey we've been on at Stanford Children's in creating the Clinical Research Support Office. And this office grew out of an abundant need as we recognized there was a dramatically increasing clinical and translational research portfolio, and yet there wasn't the mechanisms or vehicles in which to efficiently execute these studies, which was really causing a number of hurdles and burdens, which we'll go through in today's presentation. And I think importantly, you'll see as a common thread as we present this afternoon is that we at Stanford, as I'm sure many of you, depending on where you are in your various institutions, believe that clinical care and research are really reciprocally beneficial to each other and highly synergistic. And this is really the CRSO, or Clinical Research Support Office, is kind of the bring to life attempt to demonstrate that. So Dr. Oro did an introduction for me, far better than I could do for myself. I am a practicing pediatric surgeon. I'm a faculty member at Stanford University School of Medicine, but I work and take care of children at the Children's Hospital, which is one of the key aspects that we're going to cover in today's symposium, which is how can you have your research in one location and yet you take care of patients in another, and really we need to bring together these two different roles and initiatives. And as Dr. Oro said, I am fortunate to serve as the Associate Dean for Maternal Child Health Research, which means one of my jobs is, again, is to bridge all the research that's coming from the School of Medicine and helping to execute it at the Children's Hospital. And I'm fortunate to serve as one of the co-investigators on our NCAT CTSA award, as he said. Very fortunate to have recruited Alyson back to Stanford. Actually, she had a long history in various research roles here at Stanford. And then we recruited her back approximately a year ago when we went live or formalized the Clinical Research Support Office. And hopefully you'll get a sense for the progress that we've made in the last year under her leadership. And of course, we're working incredibly close together. Alyson will pick up the second half of the talk. I'll hand off to her and she'll give you really some of the great progress and efforts that she has ongoing and that continue. So with that, I'd like to just boil down to specifically what are we going to address? And when we think about the scope of work that the Clinical Research Support Office is attempting to undertake, it really comes down to answering one fundamental question, which is a common theme, and that is how do we execute patient research within a healthcare system that's designed primarily for clinical care? I mean, even at Stanford, where obviously it's a research-intensive School of Medicine and university, research was historically concentrated on the T0 and kind of preclinical research, if you will. And this has all been transforming in the last 10 years. But how do we bring this to reality at the Children's Hospital? And that's largely what we're going to talk about today as you go through the evolution of clinical and translational research from first discovery or observation all the way through clinical trials and potentially commercialization of whether it's a drug or a device or a biologic for that matter. So with that, as part of the introduction, our agenda for today is to look at some of the challenges in bridging clinical and translational research, specifically in a maternal and child health setting, because the Children's Hospital, and we're going to be exclusive to a discussion about the Children's Hospital this afternoon. Two, we're going to talk about the vision for the office in support of the organization's mission, even at the Children's Hospital, which includes a large part of research as the third pillar of an academic health center. And then we're going to share some of our approach to addressing clinical research challenges. We're going to provide 4 case studies to give real examples of real world problems. Some of them are works in progress and some of them have been completed and are success stories. So to make sure that we're level set and we're all on the same page, the definition that we're going to use this afternoon for clinical and translational research is that it's patient oriented. And typically most people kind of default to that research which requires an IRB. So this is research conducted with human subjects or on materials of human origin for which an investigator directly interacts with human subjects. Importantly, this excludes potential in vitro studies, even though they may be dealing with human cells or tissues, they cannot necessarily be traced back to a specific individual. And therefore that's a slightly different, and again, that's more of the preclinical research domain for which not only investigators at Stanford, but I'm sure many of you partake. This includes studies of mechanism of disease through observational studies and biologic studies, therapeutic interventions, clinical trials, testing of new technologies and devices, epidemiologic and behavioral, and of course, outcomes and health services research. So in order just to understand some of the challenges that we're facing, this slide depicts the ecosystem at Stanford Medicine. Stanford Medicine is a healthcare system that includes 2 hospitals, Stanford Healthcare, which is the adult hospital, and Stanford Children's Health, which includes a birthing hospital, thus the maternal and child care, taking care of children all the way from birth, actually even reproduction and infertility, all the way through to age 18, 21, and beyond, depending on the nature of the illness or disease. And then there's the Stanford School of Medicine. And these three entities are united under the Stanford Medicine architecture. Historically, and you could just use me as an example, and perhaps Dr. Oro, we're Stanford University employees, we're faculty members and principal investigators partaking in our own research portfolio. But in my case, for example, as I alluded to, my practice is centered at the Stanford Children's Hospital. So if I intend to do clinical studies in patients of interest to me, I have to bridge that responsibility, and the two organizations have to work together closely in order that I might execute my research effectively. And that's ultimately what the Clinical Research Support Office is there to do. So at Stanford Children's, importantly, research and science are part of the vision and mission. As we can see here, the vision is to heal humanity through science. I mean, top line. The mission is the typical 3 pillars of an academic healthcare center and includes, as the third pillar, breakthrough discoveries. So this is something that we don't just talk about, but we have to actually bring to action. And we're very proud that Lucile Packard Children's Hospital just recently was announced in the top 10 honor roll as ranked by US News and World Report. It is also a magnet recognized hospital for its excellence in nursing. And so to match that clinical excellence, bringing the research portfolio into the Children's Hospital and making it equally as effective and efficient and successful. And as finally depicted on this slide is one of the key strategies that the organization, in this case, the hospital itself, takes is to advance academic and clinical medicine. And in the small print here, some of the bullet points include invest in precision health initiatives like genomics, definitive and curative medicine, the Metabolic Health Center that Dr. Oro alluded to. These are initiatives wherein we absolutely must interact with the patients, and it's a two-way responsibility and relationship in order to make observations and provide for benefits. A focus on execution in our centers of excellence. There's up to 6 centers of excellence at the Children's Hospital, which are clinical programs, but they differentiate themselves given their highly innovative and cutting-edge research that they do. And then finally, support and advance Stanford Medicine's leadership in academics and training, which is the educational pillar. So we're dealing with a very large organization when we speak about the Women and Children's Hospital. This is a depiction of the new hospital, which opened, I believe, in December of 2018 and became fully functional approximately a year ago in 2019 and continues to function even with the recent changes in our world related to COVID-19. It houses more than 150 medical specialties. Itself is 361 beds. We're a level 1 pediatric trauma center, and importantly, we deliver over 4,000 babies a year, again, providing for the fully vertical and horizontal integration of patient care that is so necessary in order to execute a highly differentiated clinical and translational research portfolio. So as I said earlier, as depicted on this slide, I think it's fair to say that Stanford School of Medicine was historically known largely for its preclinical research. And this would be the discovery, whether we're looking at genes and biomarkers, pathways, and mechanisms of diseases. And then with the introduction of the Clinical and Translational Scientific Award through NCATS over 10 years ago, of which Stanford is a member hub institution, there became this recognition that we needed to expand, and in order to fully benefit from our basic research was to push further into clinical and translational research. However, we needed to build out the infrastructure since that wasn't historically one of our great strengths. And while we had these programs of excellence in the clinical setting, including at Stanford Children's Health, there needed to be an entity in between to bring these two aspects together. So just this past year, the Maternal Child Health Research Institute enjoyed its 10-year anniversary. And MCHRI, as you can see through the gears here, is really the instrument through which we conduct and unite clinical care and our clinical and translational research. The Stanford Maternal Child Health Research Institute, which is the sponsor for this symposium and many others that Dr. Oro introduced, has really been about supporting pilot and early research, as well as pilot studies and educational grants to our trainees and junior investigators, and increasingly focused on resources, since the Clinical Research Support Office currently is fully funded and supported as well as operationalized through the Maternal Child Health Research Institute as we push further and further into the T1 through T4 types of research as depicted on this slide. Now, at Stanford, as I'm sure is true of many of you, we truly believe that to be in an effective healthcare enterprise, we need to be a learning healthcare system. And we also believe that research and clinical care not only should, but must be complementary and synergistic. Specifically, if we're going to do clinical trials and comparative effectiveness or molecular and biologic data, obviously the patient is at the center of this. This requires rich information that's patient-focused, which typically exists, just as a concrete example, within the electronic medical record, which is largely a domain of the Children's Hospital and the hospital leadership. Therefore, these relationships, in order to be able to access that, remain nimble, and respond to challenges as they arise, really requires a new way of thinking. We need to aggregate data to create evidence, and then we need to analyze this, transform it, understand what it means, create new discoveries, and put those back into the clinical setting, thus the depiction of kind of this circular self-improvement cycle, if you will, when we think about what does a learning healthcare system do, and how our schools of medicine that are tightly linked with a variety of patient care settings are able to execute this, of which we're very fortunate at Stanford to have that type of relationship. So moving forward for a moment, let's just take the lens of the investigator. And as depicted on this slide, it really builds from left to right. We find that many investigators, almost irrespective of their degree of experience in conducting clinical and translational or patient-oriented research, believe, perhaps correctly, that that research begins once you have IRB approval, and then you're ready to go and off and running. You can initiate your study. In reality, as many of us understand, there's a number of steps here which historically have been underappreciated. We all get that you have to have a budget that you can work out, but many times we find is that researchers don't appreciate that there's going to be costs incurred when the research actually starts to get initiated and executed within the Children's Hospital. And there's many, many examples of this. The one that's highlighted here in the middle is that, again, research information largely contained within our electronic medical records and other data sources, whether it be a radiographic or a pathologic database, all needs to be linked and brought together in order to more efficiently and effectively execute many of our research endeavors. And so this includes things such as encounter linking, creating research-specific order sets, allowing for research notes or adverse events, various specific data sets that have to be procured from the electronic medical record. So this has required us to really dig in deep and partner with informatics services at Packard. And we've assigned a role, Mr. Cjo Thomas, who Dr. Oro alluded to, will present an even deeper dive into just that domain alone in approximately 2 weeks via the same seminar. But thinking more broadly, we then move further towards study initiation. There's research operations, which includes things like how do you recruit patients when they're in a bed or they're in one of our clinics at one of our many satellite clinics to enroll them into research? How do you do this consenting and keep track of it longitudinally and linking it back to the patient's overall clinical record? Since increasingly we want to create this culture where there's very little separation between every patient that comes to us should be afforded the opportunity to be a participant in some of our cutting edge research as a right and a privilege, as well as a responsibility for us to be able to offer that. And then finally, even the scheduling of clinic visits and making sure that interpreter services are available within what's already provided by the clinical setting of the Children's Hospital, and not having to duplicate those efforts, but rather build on them when we talk about a research study for one of our patients in our clinical setting. So the challenges are numerous. Protocols are increasingly more complex. An area of interest of Dr. Oro's, which is the Center for Definitive and Curative Medicine, is all about biologics, it's cell therapy, it's gene editing. You can imagine the degree of complexity that this introduces when we have patients who are undergoing these very innovative therapies in a patient bed. There's an increasing number of studies and sponsors, both for-profit, federal, philanthropic. All of these have their own specific requirements and specific types of relationships that have to be built and understood, as far as something as rudimentary as how much does a bed cost depending on who the sponsor is. The increasing availability of data, both internal as well as external to our walls. There's obviously, importantly, an increasing regulatory burden, not the least of which is to protect patient privacy and ensure safety. And then finally, how do we scale all of this and make sure that it remains efficient? By no means do we view ourselves as putting up roadblocks. Rather, we attempt to, in the short and long term, decrease the number of burdens and number of hurdles to make this more seamless. And a term we like to use, both Alyson and myself, is that we view ourselves as the honest broker. We are not the research police. We're really here to bring the handshake, if you will, between the investigator and the setting in which those studies need to be done to make sure it can be done, again, as efficiently as possible. So when we were formulating the Clinical Research Support Office, I hesitate to show this, but it's certainly important to get a sense for how we've organized ourselves. And this slide is appropriately titled Opportunity Analysis surrounding the research processes at Stanford Children's Hospital. So if you recall 2 or 3 slides back when I said, okay, you've got your IRB and you're pretty sure you understand a budget. Now, how is this all going to happen and come together? Because I'm going to put patients in a bed and I'm going to do research studies. Many of those patients, which is probably most true of patients with surgical oncologic problems or children's cancer, all of those patients are essentially, with some exceptions, on some type of research protocol through the Children's Oncology Group. And so what we found is that when we start to break this down, and this is a so-called fishbone analysis, which is in the parlance of lean methodology, which is in place both clinically, operationally, as well as performance improvement at Packard, we find that if we begin with finance, we began to find that these were some of the opportunities that were lacking in our infrastructure that really needed to be put in place in order to really allow our throughput to proceed in a more effective way. And I'll just give you a few examples. Under finance, there was really a lack of oversight and training for research teams to study finance setup and make sure that it was compliance. Our research billing was still in paper as well as electronically linked to specific encounters. Information services, which again will be covered in approximately 2 weeks by our colleague, Mr. C. Joe Thomas, is a whole area where we very frequently come back to. But what the overall issue is that there was no overarching IS governance or prioritization strategy for research requests. And what we observed is that investigators would come, and they were very well-intentioned and well-meaning, and they would come and say, you know what, I need help with transferring 2 terabytes of data. It's going to come over to a research server. Can you help with that? And inevitably, of course, that requires some time or FTE if that information originated in a clinical setting. Clinical labs is another area or domain. Pharmacy, how do we prepare those agents and account for the pharmacist's time and the appropriate preparation of agents that will be administered to patients typically in a clinical setting or clinical trial type aspect. There's nursing, all the protocols and training and communication that has to occur between our clinical nurses, who are the front line providers, and who are now going to be dealing again with this patient who is both a patient of ours, but also a participant in research. And it goes on and on. But basically, we broke this down into the 10 domains as depicted here. And we took on as our responsibility as part of the Clinical Research Support Office to unite all these together and to begin to knock down these barriers and to create the infrastructure to overcome these challenges. We put up a governance structure, which we'll show you in another slide or two. But basically, if you summarize all of those issues, it really comes down to how do we mitigate the risks while taking care of the responsibility that falls somewhere between the School of Medicine faculty and their research teams, as well as the hospital administration, since we are increasingly utilizing hospital resources, which again, per our slide and our initial question, were originally formulated and put in place to primarily serve patient clinical care. And this includes a strong relationship, which we've developed with hospital privacy and compliance, a strong relationship where we have ongoing conversations with patient financial services. We deal continuously with issues around patient safety, particularly for the high-risk clinical trial workflows. And finally, reputational risk to the hospital and to the university in order to make us bring that research portfolio all the way to the leading children's hospital reputation that we currently enjoy from a clinical perspective, and to scale these systems effectively. So briefly, one of the challenges, or one of the biggest challenges to any clinical research, particularly clinical trials, is appropriate patient enrollment and meeting our enrollment needs. So this is a success story in part, as depicted on the left-hand part of the slide, that we've partnered with the School of Medicine's Dean's Office and our Research Participant Program, which is one of the CTSA endeavors as part of a hub institution, whereby we launched this past year the ability to use Epic Children's instance of MyChart and direct email to our patients to invite them into research so that we would be able to have this and initiate this two-way conversation by patient matching and investigator matching. And again, this is done in a honest broker format whereby we have no particular interest in one party or the other necessarily as participants in the research, but yet we're there to be the broker in the middle and to really hook up patients of interest who are willing and wanting to participate in research and an investigator who's trying to fill out their particular cohort. In addition to that, being responsive and nimble with the arrival of COVID-19 pandemic this past spring, we quickly pivoted and we created the Stanford Research Registry for COVID, which the URL is depicted on the right-hand side of the slide here. And the idea of what this was to not only identify patients at, and now I'm talking more broadly, not only at the children's hospital, but also at the adult hospital, but those patients outside our walls, those patients that are not specifically patients of the Stanford healthcare system initially who could reach us through a website, sign up for and express interest in research. We would then be able to link back to appropriate studies, and this would include the full spectrum of whether it's a pregnant woman, a child, a pediatric study, or an adult study. And this is really getting going with the number of participants and signups increasing. And again, there's a URL there, and you can see where if you're a patient, you can join the research registry, and if you're an investigator, you can do some more exploration on how this may be a benefit to your studies. So with that, and the preceding observations, in order to pursue this Vision 2025, which is to heal humanity through science, compassion, providing extraordinary care through continual learning and breakthrough discoveries, we feel that the need was to focus our research efforts and our funding investment. And the funding, by the way, for the Maternal Child Health Research Institute is largely twofold. It comes from our foundation, the Packard Foundation, which supports the Institute, as well as some operational funds that come through the Children's Hospital itself to the director, specifically Dr. Mary Leonard. The need was to align clinical programmatic excellence and research goals. Many, many examples exist to this. I think, again, one of the best ones was our Center for Definitive and Curative Medicine, where we're really looking at biologics and how we bring those into the clinic. Reduce research redundancy in infrastructure and services. Alyson is now going to provide for some really case studies on how we've been able to effectively pursue that. And create the structure accounting for and representing these different entities, the School of Medicine, Stanford Children's Health, and the Maternal Child Health Research Institute for the needed investments currently as well as going forward and the shared responsibilities. And that was the basis for the Clinical Research Support Office, which is depicted on this slide. So final slide for me is just to demonstrate that the importance of being vertically integrated with, at the top line here, you can see that the governing board and the direct reports at the highest level for the Maternal Child Health Research Institute is both to hospital CEO, Mr. Paul King, and School of Medicine, Dr. Lloyd Minor. Mary Leonard is our chair of pediatrics and the overall director of the Maternal Child Health Research Institute, and Dr. Zorro and Stevenson are our co-directors. Immediately reporting up through there, you can see at the bottom in the green box here is our Clinical Research Support Office, for which I am the director, and Alyson is our Research Operations Manager. You'll hear again in 2 weeks from Mr. C. Joe Thomas for a deep dive into clinical research informatics and how that is both affected and organized. And so again, the importance is you really have to unite, and this slide really speaks to how we're so vertically integrated so that we can get executive buy-in, both bottom up and top down, for our ability to execute and take advantage of these opportunities. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Ms. Alyson Falwell. Alyson.
Thanks, Dr. Sylvester. So when the CRSO first formally came together, one of the foundational things we did was to establish a mission, a charter, and a governance framework to help guide and focus us. We think of our deliverable as helping to effectively manage hospital clinical operational resources and infrastructure that supports or facilitates clinical research through people, processes, and technology. And again, as Dr. Sylvester said, the role of our office is to facilitate research under an honest broker framework, looking to solve for all parties and not serve as the research police. Next slide, please. So this is our governance model, which has been in place for approximately a year. The Executive Advisory Committee in the top in green includes leadership from the Children's Hospital and the School of Medicine and the Maternal Child Health Research Institute. This committee meets once per month. The core team in blue includes Dr. Sylvester as our director and Mary Chen, the executive director of MCHRI. And then our informatics manager, Sijo, who you'll hear from in 2 weeks, and our research manager round out the core team. The work groups in the bottommost box are broken into 2 categories. The boxes in pink on the left are those that are being facilitated in partnership with the hospital's performance improvement department and following a lean methodology. So these work groups have charters and utilize a structured problem-solving approach. And as issues are identified, they're scoped. Work groups are formed with key stakeholders that define and solve the problems. And then over time, these work groups will spin up into existence, and then ultimately, we hope, wind down as challenges are resolved and new challenges are identified. Work groups in orange on the right are those pre-existing groups that meet regularly and address kind of ongoing operational challenges between the School of Medicine and the hospitals. Next slide, please. So a bit about the role of the Executive Advisory Committee. We're, as Karl alluded to, we're in the midst of a culture change that's requiring new approaches to pursuing our vision and mission at Stanford Children's Health. Historically, there's been somewhat of a cultural divide between the School of Medicine and the hospital, in that the school does research and the hospital does clinical care, but we all know that that's just not true. And so we need to work together and facilitate research in the hospital as part of our organizational mission and culture. So changing a culture requires support both from the top down and also the bottom up. And so this Executive Advisory Committee has a really key role to play in helping facilitate this change in culture through endorsing our office as the channel through which clinical and translational research activities in the hospital are managed, providing us as a core team with strategic direction and advising us on setting priorities, and then determining our authority to execute on the mission strategy in accordance with hospital administration. Next slide, please. So turning to some case studies of some of the things we've been working on moving into the practical realm, we wanted to share some examples of how we do our work and what we've identified as some critical success elements to leading this work. Some of these issues are resolved, but many of them are actively ongoing with partners across both the hospital and the School of Medicine. It's important to note that these are primarily operational updates. There are many other works in progress and case studies of success in the research informatics space that are led by our research informatics manager in IS. And these will be discussed in more detail during an upcoming seminar in 2 weeks. You can look forward to that. So this first case study focuses on a new research intake process we're developing at the hospital. Historically, we have struggled to have a full and total view of the entirety of clinical and translational research happening at the hospital. Information lives in different systems across both the School of Medicine and the hospital and is really very decentralized. So the hospital doesn't have a database that captures all active research taking place inside its walls. Another thing to note is that as we were forming this office, we met with more and more stakeholders in departments and clinical units and service lines in the hospital. We continue to hear the same challenge repeated over and over, that the hospital departments and units often don't learn about new clinical research studies despite best intentions until really late in the activation process, and often not until a study is ready to enroll its first patient. So units and departments in the hospital then need to scramble to support operationalizing the trial in their area, often without the ability to recover costs. So this lack of involvement in the early stages of study startup means that the hospital really experiences an inability to assess departmental resources that are required to support trials, an inability to plan for hospital staffing and training to support those trials, and an inability for the departments, when appropriate, to build support into the study budget. So the solution we're developing is an electronic intake portal designed to be completed by investigators as far upstream as possible in the study startup process. And ideally, this is completed when an investigator is writing a grant or is first approached by a sponsor about a new clinical trial. The investigator or their research team visits our electronic portal to fill out a survey, a brief survey that contains key questions about the proposed project, such as the patient population, the expected enrollment volume, and the projected start date. And then as part of this intake, the investigator is going to indicate which departments or units inside the hospital are going to be required to support the study, such as pharmacy, biomedical engineering, and rehabilitation services, for example. And then for each department indicated, a series of cascading questions is released that ask some really basic information that that department needs to know about a new research study. We worked really closely with each of these departments in purple listed here to understand when they hear about a potential new research study, what are the top line 2 to 3 questions that they always ask in order to assess feasibility. Throughout the hospital, we continue to hear how enthusiastic our clinical and operational partners are about research, and they want to be able to support it as efficiently as possible. So we then included their questions in the intake so that the investigator can answer them up front. And then this information gets sent electronically to the hospital departments. the goal of this really being to facilitate conversations at its core, so that the study team and the hospital can be planning together as early as possible. These departments are included in version 1.0 as we're thinking about it of this intake. And these are the stakeholders in pink that have been really important to our work. Over time, we plan to work with other areas across the hospital to fold them into this process. But some of the critical success elements that we've found so far include understanding the needs of each hospital department, ensuring that you have key departmental or unit champions for research, and then simplicity to start and not over-engineering, as is really tempting to do, any initial intake, electronic intake or database. Next slide, please. So this next issue is an issue that we worked on for about a year, but COVID-19 really accelerated our need for a solution to ensure that School of Medicine staff coming into the hospital as part of approved research studies knew the safety and emergency preparedness protocols and had the training to keep themselves as well as our patients and families safe. So the problem was that there was no process or oversight to ensure that School of Medicine staff working inside the walls of the hospital were in compliance with the hospital's non-employee policy. This meant that School of Medicine staff working in the hospital weren't trained on the hospital's fire and life safety, infection prevention and control, and emergency preparedness protocols because they weren't hospital employees and the school didn't provision this training. On the flip side, hospital staff who are engaged in supporting research, many of them to a very significant extent, were not consistently receiving the human subjects protection or GCP trainings that are required by the School of Medicine, since these users were employed by the hospital. So in essence, you could think of it as the employees of each entity were invisible to the other from a training and compliance perspective. So we held multiple meetings over 12 months with key partners in the School of Medicine and Stanford Children's Health, including HR, informatics, regulatory, and the e-learning teams. Our approach kind of at a high level was to compare the screening and training requirements for hospital and university employees side by side, determine where there were areas of equivalency, such as code of conduct and privacy training, and determine where there were gaps in training. So the work group developed and agreed upon a series of recommendations for additional key training for School of Medicine employees working in Stanford Children's Health, particularly around fire and life safety, infection prevention and control, and emergency preparedness, and hospital employees who are significantly engaged in research around human subjects protections. Our office is going to monitor compliance, and because this is a bidirectional problem with a bidirectional solution, we're thinking of this in a staged approach. So stage one being we're focusing on School of Medicine staff who are working inside the hospital this summer and fall. And stage two will be focusing on bringing training to Stanford Children's Health staff who are significantly engaged in research over the fall and winter. Critical success elements here, knowing who your subject matter experts are and recruiting them. Solving this problem really required a shared understanding of the risk, both to the hospital, but also the School of Medicine, and then the ability to work across organizations. Next slide, please. So remote research sponsor monitoring in the hospital's electronic medical record was something that folks had been wanting for a long time, but that hadn't been possible due to the Privacy Office's reluctance to approve this. So again, this is another case where COVID really accelerated the need for a solution, since many clinical trials across the School of Medicine were put on hold until safety and compliance could be monitored by sponsors. But without the ability to come to campus, monitors required an electronic and remote solution to be able to monitor these clinical trials. So the Clinical Research Support Office and MCHRI partnered with Hospital Privacy and HIMSS and IS Security and a bunch of other departments inside the hospital, including access control, to develop an approved process for remote research sponsor monitoring in the hospital's electronic medical record. It took many meetings and working sessions over several months to enable this process, but this is one of the cases where we can report success. We were able to launch this on June 18th. We held 2 live demos with Q&A sessions for attendees, about 40 attendees. We're in the process of developing tip sheets and on-demand training for research monitors. We're continuing to tweak the timelines and workflows. So it's important to maintain these relationships, and this is a really iterative process that we're in. It's also important to note that MCHRI already had a process in place for in-person monitor access. So because of this, we had a history of partnering with many of these offices in pink. So we knew each other's roles and how to collaborate. We devised this revised workflow that's displayed on the screen. It's really tiny, so that the goal is not to read every little box, but really to illustrate the complexity of this process and the many partners that were needed to make it work. The critical success elements here are having leadership support from the hospital, including our executive sponsor, Rick Majan, the COO, as well as Natalie Pagel, the chief CMIO. Development and nurturing of key relationships really over many years, and then a shared understanding of the work and the partnership that was required to get it done successfully. Next slide, please. So this is an ongoing opportunity. We were approached by Stem Cell Transplant, who had 3 to 4 trials in their queue, but couldn't get those trials launched due to the inability to understand really the true cost for some complex clinical procedures that were needed to develop a budget. We realized there was really an inability of the current structure for industry trials to pay for the full justified costs of these trials. So the goal of this work at the outset was to understand the true hospital costs of providing care associated with research and develop what we call a source of truth to guide School of Medicine budget negotiations with sponsors. So this was a complex issue that was seen as a problem by many different entities, but each had their own lens and pain point, both within the hospital and also the School of Medicine. This group has been meeting every 6 to 8 weeks for more than a year. We've had really tremendous engagement. Briefly, just kind of walk you through our approach. We first mapped the research budgeting and billing process end to end. We scoped this work group in terms of what part of that process was going to be in scope for us and what part was going to be out of scope for another day. We identified, grouped, and prioritized all of the challenges, and then developed 3 subgroups. The first subgroup has been working to pursue development of what we're calling a bundle for complex clinical procedures. This has taken extensive data analysis requiring several hospital departments, several 90-minute meetings with this work group to review the data and think through the operational and informatics considerations. Interestingly, we're at a point where we've determined that this bundle development approach is probably not scalable for us, so we're looking at alternative ways to get to our goal. But even getting to this point was really the result of phenomenal engagement from both across the hospital and the school, as well as the hospital's performance improvement department, who has really done a great job of both facilitating this work, but also teaching many of us about the lean methodology. So the lessons learned here are that it cannot be overstated the importance of a performance improvement methodology for solving complex problems, as well as having an expert and neutral facilitator, especially when there are lots of different stakeholders involved in solving problems, an understanding of the complexity and the entities involved. And then it's a good practice to always return to the charter and the mission to refresh your focus. And there's an image on this slide of our charter. Again, not meant to read, but just illustrative of the robust process that we were taken through by the Performance Improvement Department. Next slide, please. So the final case study is really that over the past year, we've received many questions from School of Medicine research teams about when and for what types of studies they needed to send the signed research informed consent form into HIMSS for upload into the electronic medical record. So it became clear that the hospital's expectations about what type of research informed consent forms should be uploaded into EPIC, in what time frame and how, were unclear to School of Medicine research teams. And this results in inconsistent practices across teams. So the School of Medicine classifies research in many different categories, diagnostic, observational, treatment, etc. And it wasn't really clear what type of studies needed to be uploaded into the legal medical record. So as part of scoping this problem, we identified that there were some key offices in the hospital that needed to participate in the conversation and would have points of view on this topic. So we convened a meeting with partners in privacy, regulatory, medical records, as well as the hospital's policy manager. And the first step was to figure out kind of the what, how, and when. What ICFs or informed consent forms needed to be uploaded, how should these documents get into HIMSS, and how soon after signing a consent form did that form need to be uploaded into the legal medical record. And then the next step is really figuring out kind of the what and in terms of the appropriate mechanism for providing this guidance. So we're in the process right now of developing a draft guidance for school medicine research teams. Critical to this effort has been, again, a shared understanding of the problem we're trying to solve, stakeholder willingness to engage, and then the ability to deploy and refine. We agreed that after developing the guidance, we're going to need to continue to check in and make process improvements to refine the guidance and the timelines over time. Next slide, please. So wrapping up, we wanted to let you know about our new CRSO webpage on the MCHRI website. The address is here, and we encourage you to visit to learn more about CRSO or to get in touch with us if our team can help in any way. And over time, the webpage will continue to be updated with relevant resources and information. Next slide, please. So some key takeaways and lessons learned as we continue to work together with hospital and school of medicine colleagues. They're listed here. Again, being an honest broker and not the research police has really been our kind of guiding principle in how we approach every conversation that we have. I think the common nomenclature at the very bottom is a significant point. At Stanford, depending on where you are in the university or the hospital, clinical trial is defined differently. And even research has a different meaning to different groups. For example, one hospital department we spoke with defines research as anything that is not patient-facing. And clinical trials are different from research. So creating a common shared data dictionary, if you will, is really key to developing a robust culture of research. Next slide, please. So final thoughts. Despite best intentions, research efforts between the hospital and the university aren't always optimally coordinated, and our office is really here to help enhance this coordination. We want to thank our partners both across the hospital and the school, many of whom are listed in these slides, and we look forward to continuing to partner with all of them in the years to come. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Oro for questions. Great.
That was wonderful. Dr. Sylvester and Alyson, and thanks so much for really an amazing and thoughtful presentation about how to accelerate and build the infrastructure to accelerate research, to be the honest broker. We have a number of different questions, which I'd like to address now. And so a couple of them are aspirational and a couple of them are very specific. So first, the aspirational ones. You just started the CRSO. What would be, for example, in a few years, what would be a deliverable that you'd like to see that would say that you're successful? What do you hope to accomplish in a few years that would tell you that you're on the right track in terms of metrics?
So Tony, thanks for that question and for posing it. I think big picture is, right, we're all in this game, meaning investigation, clinical care, and research to ultimately benefit patients. And so to ultimately benefit patients, of course, part of our ethos is, can we do clinical and translational research effectively? The concrete example would be the number of studies started and effectively completed at the Children's Hospital. We're starting with a denominator, if you will, of the number of studies we know that potentially could be done, in some cases that are partially done, and then of course there's a whole queue and bolus that's coming in to be done. And so what we'd really like to see is that the effectiveness of starting and completing studies and the number therein that are taking place at the Children's Hospital as the highest or top level performance metric.
And so then some more specific types of questions. For example, are you currently looking at process improvement for contract processing execution timelines? I mean, are timelines, are those also part of your metrics?
Wow, great question. I'm going to ask Alyson to comment, but in short, we recently introduced a project tracker tool, which is going to include timelines on and off target. It provides for transparency. So in addition, when we hit blockers, we can pass those on to our executive sponsors to help us move through those. It's important also that we're in constant communication and a really strong partnership with many School of Medicine, like the RMG, right, and RF for contracting purposes. And so these are two-way conversations at all time. We've got a long list. They are by priority, they are by deadline, and we are approaching those as a PI or on or off target type approach. Alyson, do you have other comments on that, please?
No, I would say, thanks for the question. We've been asked this before, and the contracting piece is a complex one and involves a lot of different offices. So, you know, our ability to exert influence across the School of Medicine is going to be limited to partnerships with other offices. So it's something that we may bring in scope for our office to help improve. But that's a particularly complex issue that we're aware of, and we're happy to help partner to solve.
Right. Because as well as when PI approaches to actually apply for example, an NIH grant, for example, and then you say, here's what it's going to cost and where all the different pieces, the contracting issue is also with the industry is also important as well. And so that's why it's a big lift, but one which is super important. Also in terms of big lifts, what about with the IRB? For example, how does the CRSO, one question is, to what extent does the IRB support the initiatives being developed by the CRSO? The org chart didn't seem to show the relationship being developed. Is Stanford IRB on board, or do you have to actually educate them as well?
Great question. Again, I'll take a first crack at it, and then we'll invite Alyson to comment as well. So interesting, I think perhaps even at Stanford, sometimes people misconstrue what an IRB's maybe central and then total role is. So for example, at Stanford, our IRB does not look at, typically they don't look at either scientific feasibility or operational feasibility. And we are creating two different vehicles to address that even more explicitly. For the scientific integrity, there's an initiative being launched by Ken Mahaffey and our CTSA as a hub called the Clinical Research Units, where we'll have content experts review protocols and studies for their feasibility. And this would typically be for something that's not otherwise looked at by an expert like an NIH submission. So NIH submissions that are looked at by other content experts, not necessary. And the other one being feasibility for operationalizing it, that increasingly we're taking on. So the IRB, we have a very good relationship with. It is a two-way conversation. And ultimately we see is that as they have questions or would have any concerns about either scientific feasibility or technical operational feasibility, we'll be in a position to help answer those questions. Alyson.
No, nothing else to add. Great answer.
Great. And so a couple more practical questions. So the first is, it looks like you have the website there, the URL for investigators to initiate interaction with the CRSO. When will it actually be available for intake? Will the intake process be mandatory for all new studies eventually, or is this is just it'd be a nice thing to have if you can't do it yourself? Is this a mandatory thing, or is it more of it'd be nice to have?
Wow, great question. Again, I'll take a very brief answer, but this is really Alyson's expertise and domain. Ultimately, the vision is that it's must have and must go through. We don't want to build something that we're not yet ready to take in everybody. So we're still in pilot phase and kind of going with a minimal viable product approach first to try to get our arms around the size of this so that we can scale it. Alyson.
Yes, it is ultimately going to be required for any hospital resources that are going to be required to support a study. Right now, as Dr. Sylvester said, we're really in the final stages of refining the tool and firing all of the auto notifies and those sorts of things. So we're going to be piloting it over the next 6 to 8 weeks and starting to communicate more about it and how to use it and when to use it. And then we will be launching it with good communication and some tutorials probably this fall.
Great. And then the intake form also includes documents that you as well. And then what is the electronic platform you're using to do that? Yeah,
I can take that one. So for now, we're using REDCap first iteration of this tool. Ultimately, we want to migrate it over to a platform that the hospital's using, but it's just that platform isn't quite ready to support this yet. We understand there are a lot of intake processes across the School of Medicine, and so our goal here is not to create another administrative burden for faculty or for research staff. But really, there's nothing right now, all of the information that's collected across the School of Medicine, the hospital's not getting that. So this is designed really to provide key information that the hospital needs in order to be prepared to support those studies. So details in terms of what you're uploading and when will be forthcoming. We're trying to make it as lean as possible so that there's a little redundancy in the number of systems that investigators need to use as possible.
And then a related question, can the CRSO help research teams create bridges or foster relationships between hospital and School of Medicine staff? For example, can we use you to say we need something, this part of it, and can you hook us up?
Short answer, yes, by all means, Alyson. Alyson is the point person for those, and she can expand on that.
Yes, that's exactly one of the key things we're here to do. So please come to us, tell us who you need to be in touch with or what problem you're trying to solve, and we can help facilitate those connections in the different units, departments, and service lines within the hospital.
Right. And then where can we get information on how to connect that? Or is there a URL or email of a point person that can actually get us started? Or are there educational webinars that can help us get going?
Yeah, so we can provide Alyson's contact information or the website, and then the webinar, and we've referenced it several times now, in 2 weeks is going to be a deep dive into really clinical research informatics, and particularly using EPIC as the primary example, and C.J. Thomas will provide that. But Alyson, what's your preferred way of contact, through the website or email?
People can contact me. The website has my contact information on it, so you can go and find it there. But absolutely, just send me an email, and we will help get you connected to the right people.
So this webinar will be on recorded and on our the MCHR website. So with all the information and URLs that you need, in 2 weeks there'll be a deep dive into the clinical informatics, which will be very important. So if you've thought this webinar was very useful, the one in 2 weeks will be sort of a part 2 of a deep dive that will be very helpful for investigators to access these resources at the School of Medicine and Children's Hospital. And so last question is, success always breeds more and more issues. And so it's quite likely that if you guys are doing well, as it seems like you are in terms of accelerating, there'll be way more investigator needs than you have at resources. So how will you prioritize the limited resources that you have to help as many investigators as possible?
Yeah, great question. I'll probably give a partial answer with pre-apology, but we think that this is going to require, and that we're in the midst of a cultural change. And that is, and we've heard, everyone agrees that, like I said, they're increasing less separation and more overlap and synergy between what's clinical care and what is research. And thankfully, and really kudos to them, the hospital administration says, yes, we get it. There's actually hidden costs and kind of unrecognized sponsorship of research because of this utilization of hospital systems. We're just surfacing that so everyone can fully appreciate how much the hospital already does support research. And by continuing that conversation and building on what already exists, for example, IS, pharmacy, lab, that we can build processes to scale all these requests by building on what's already been built for clinical care. I mean, I think that's the core message to what we've presented today and really how we're trying to go about this from a CRSO perspective. And then finally, we enjoy and always need more, of course, financial support through the foundation, MCHRI, and the Children's Hospital, as well as the School of Medicine through the CTSA is important. Yep.
Great. And then last question, can you, next in 2 weeks, C.J. Thomas will talk about clinical informatics. Can you give a little plug for why someone should then tune in 2 weeks for this second part? Why is it so important?
So going back to what we presented today, the fishbone analysis, I think 2 or 3 of the things, certainly the remote sponsor monitoring, some of the training that Alyson presented as case studies, all of these things we found during our analysis, and as we continue to go forward, almost always comes back to some time of information systems. And the EPIC instance at Packard Children's is a primary example of that. And so again, clinical informatics services, Mr. C. Joe Thomas, his sole role within clinical research informatics is to support, within clinical information systems is to support the research endeavor. That's his full-time job while existing within clinical operations. And so this will be emblematic, and he'll demonstrate for you on how he's able to utilize his time to help us bridge these gaps.
Great. Well, we're out of time, but I just wanted to thank Dr. Sylvester and Alyson Falwell, not only just for conceiving and implementing this CRSO, seeing the need for this infrastructure to accelerate and to really help all of us clinical investigators to accelerate our research. And I hope if we have a follow-up in a few years, we'll see that the time, expense, and will actually be reduced, and the number of trials and successful trials that can be fluxing through the hospital using clinical human subjects will really be a real feather in your caps about the CRSO. So thank you very much for joining us and for the presentation today. I look forward to the second part in 2 weeks. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.